The final chapter of the Raj, how the British left India. It was a sultry August evening in 1947. The bustling cities of India were alive with whispers of hope and uncertainty. For over 200 years, the British Empire had ruled this ancient land, but the cracks in their iron grip had grown too wide to ignore. The streets were filled with a strange mix of jubilation and fear. A storm was brewing, and everyone could feel it. But how did the mighty British Empire, once called the empire on which the sun never sets, crumble in the land of Gandhi, Nehru, and Jinnah? This is the story of their departure, a tale of resilience, betrayal, chaos, and an unyielding thirst for freedom. The seeds of rebellion. The journey toward freedom began decades earlier, in the shadowy halls of colonial power. India, rich in culture and resources, had been reduced to a pawn in Britain's imperial chessboard. But beneath the surface, a storm was building. In 1885, a small group of Indians formed the Indian National Congress. What began as polite requests for reforms would transform into a roaring demand for independence. By the 1920s, the air was filled with the voice of Mahatma Gandhi, whose call for nonviolent resistance was electrifying millions. "Let us not raise a sword against the oppressors," Gandhi said, his words echoing across the country. "Let us show them the power of truth and nonviolence." But the British didn't leave so easily. They responded with brutal crackdowns. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919 was a grim reminder of the cost of defiance. Hundreds of peaceful protesters were gunned down in cold blood. Blood soaked the soil, but it also watered the seeds of rebellion. World War II, the cracks begin to show. The real unraveling began during World War II. Britain's economy was stretched to the breaking point, and they began to see India less as a jewel in the crown, and more as a financial burden. As the war raged on, the British made one desperate attempt to keep India in line, the Cripps Mission of 1942. They promised greater self-rule after the war, but the Indian leaders were no longer interested in half measures. And so, in August 1942, Gandhi stood before a crowd in Mumbai and declared the start of the Quit India movement. "We shall do or die," he thundered, calling for the British to leave immediately. Across India, people took to the streets. Strikes, protests, and rebellions erupted, shaking the British government to its core. A world on fire. By 1945, the world had changed. World War II had ended, but Britain was no longer the superpower it once was. The United States and the Soviet Union were now the global giants, and both were pressuring Britain to decolonize. But it wasn't just international pressure that was breaking the British resolve, it was India itself. In 1946, an unexpected mutiny rocked the British Raj. Thousands of sailors in the Royal Indian Navy rose up, refusing to serve under British officers. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was a warning. The British could no longer trust the very forces meant to protect their rule. Meanwhile, the streets were drenched in blood. Communal violence between Hindus and Muslims was escalating, fanned by political rivalries. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, demanded a separate nation for Muslims, Pakistan. The Congress, led by Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel, opposed the idea, but the divide was growing wider by the day. The Mountbatten Plan, a nation divided in early 1947, Lord Louis Mountbatten arrived in India as the last British viceroy. His mission? To oversee Britain's exit. But he quickly realized that leaving India intact was impossible. The communal tensions were spiraling out of control. Mountbatten made a fateful decision. India would be partitioned. Two nations would be born, India and Pakistan. The announcement sent shockwaves across the subcontinent. Families were torn apart overnight. Friends became foes. The joy of independence was overshadowed by the looming specter of partition. The midnight hour on the night of August 14, 1947, As the clock struck midnight, Jawaharlal Nehru addressed a newly free nation. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. But as the world celebrated, chaos unfolded on the ground. The partition triggered one of the largest mass migrations in history. Nearly 15 million people were uprooted, and up to 1 million lost their lives in the ensuing violence. Trains arrived at stations filled with corpses. Villages were set ablaze. The British, meanwhile, quietly slipped away. On August 15, 1947, the Union Jack was lowered, and the tricolour of India was hoisted. But for many, freedom came at a terrible cost. Why did the British leave? The British didn't leave out of generosity, they left because they had no choice. The cost of maintaining control over India had become too high. The mutinies, protests, and economic strain were more than they could bear. But above all, it was the unyielding spirit of the Indian people that forced their hand. From the salt pans of Dandi to the prisons of Andaman, Indians had fought relentlessly for their freedom. The legacy as the British ships disappeared over the horizon, they left behind a nation divided yet determined. India was free, but the scars of partition would take decades to heal. The story of how the British left India is not just a tale of political maneuvering, it's a story of resilience, sacrifice, and the indomitable human spirit. It reminds us that even the mightiest empires can be brought to their knees when the oppressed stand united. And so, the sun finally set on the British Empire in India, but the light of freedom began to shine, casting shadows that would shape the destiny of 1 billion lives.